everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be talking about something that I actually want to learn more about, and a lot of you guys have been asking me to do a video on this topic, so I figured I'd bring in an expert. And so what I am talking about is purchasing pre-owned instruments. And there are a lot of benefits to purchasing a pre-owned instrument, one of them being that you can usually get a little bit more bang for your buck, because if you purchase a new instrument that is comparable to a pre-owned instrument, the pre-owned instrument is going to be slightly cheaper depending, there's a lot of different factors that you will hear about today, but that is one of the benefits. Another benefit is that you can a lot of times find something very unique and different, especially if it's a more vintage instrument, and so that's a lot of fun to experiment with too. And so what I did, because I have never purchased a pre-owned instrument before, but I want to learn more about it, I decided to bring in the expert. So I will be having a call shortly here with Julian Rose from the Flute Center of New York, and he is very knowledgeable on this subject, so I think we'll be able to get a lot of answers from him, so I'm very excited about that. But before we jump on that call, I did want to remind you that if you are flute shopping or piccolo, alto flute, or bass flute shopping, you can use my code Gina at the Flute Center of New York's website, and you will get free shipping, an extended trial, an extended warranty, and there's actually a new perk that I worked with the Flute Center to get you guys. If you are considering consigning your flute with the Flute Center of New York, and what that means is if you want to sell your flute through the Flute Center of New York, you will get $25 off of any repairs that needs to be done on your instrument. Just mention my code Gina and you will get that. And the next video will actually be all about consigning flutes. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss that video. Hey Julian, how's it going?
It's great. How are you, Gina?
Good. Thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm so excited to talk with you today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I want to tell everybody a little bit about Julian Rose because he is amazing. I wrote down exactly your title at Flute Center because I wanted to make sure I got it correctly. He is the artist in residence as well as the chief executive officer at the Flute Center of New York. And of course, also a brilliant flute player beyond that. So is there anything else that you can tell me about yourself, like how you got started at Flute Center? I always like people to know like who's giving advice to them and everything like that.
Sure.
And obviously, you're very qualified to be giving this advice, but I want them to know why you're qualified.
Yeah, so boy, it's like my origin story. So 2012, I was a finalist in the NFA Young Artist Competition and was, thank you, very disappointed when I was eliminated in the first live round. But I was determined not to let the trip to Las Vegas be all for naught. So I went down to the exhibit hall. I had just moved to New York for a fellowship at Lincoln Center and ended up meeting the owner of the Flute Center. And I was hired a few weeks later. I was the first full-time employee at the Flute Center of New York. We had hired our second full-time employee shortly thereafter, but there was a time when if the phone rang, I would answer it. If a box needed to be packed up, I would be the one to ship it out. So I did everything. And as far as like what I do or how I got started or all that, I guess the thing I would just say is most people didn't know the Flute Center before 2012. It was a very small shop in a little tiny hole in the wall on the 11th floor of a building overlooking Central Park. And, it's just been kind of one foot in front of the other. And I've assembled, I think, the best team in the world. Very happy, but, I was employee number 1 and now we're up to 14.
Wow.
And I'm really proud of the team we've assembled and everything we've been able to accomplish serving flutists and flute players. But it's hard to describe what my job is, but suffice it to say, like when something happens at the Flute Center of New York, it's usually a collaboration between me and some other subset of the staff.
Yeah, and I think you've done that so well, is that somebody is like the expert of whatever field, or like for instance, I work a lot with Emily and she does the social media and you're working with her as well. And so it's really cool that everybody is so good at their individual jobs and then you guys come together and then you have such a thriving company.
Yeah, Emily's brilliant. She's wonderful in every possible way. But yeah, I mean, honestly, that's like the success of life, is just surrounding yourself with other people who are smarter than you are, and really talented and really capable, and letting them have ideas and spread their wings and supporting them. And I've just been really fortunate that that we've been able to find such quality talent to help us work. And to be honest, we've built a culture at the Flute Center that's very demanding, in that we all expect a lot from ourselves, but there's very little expectation from from the business, so to speak. It's really, we're all a group of friends, we're all on a team together, and all of us want to support the team. So we all work as hard as we can, and we all try to look for ways to do this thing better or that thing better, and everyone pulls their own weight. And that's really the reason it's able to be so successful.
Well, I absolutely love that. And that's the reason that I was so excited to be partnering with you starting a couple years ago. And it's just been amazing. So I'm just so thankful for this collaboration that we have going on right now. I do want to really quickly tell everybody who's watching, I have a list of questions that I've compiled that Julian has come up with, as well as I did a post on Instagram asking people what questions that they had about buying a pre-owned flute, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think a lot of people don't really know where to get started with that. And I know that you have a lot of great answers for everybody if that's something that people are looking for. So should we get started?
Let's do it.
Okay, so question number 1, what should you be aware of when purchasing a used flute? And also somebody added to that, are there any red flags that you should be looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first thing I would say is that any flute that you want to buy, new or used, would have the same red flags potentially, right? There are very few attributes that only apply to used that don't also apply to new. But for the most part, the one thing that I would just say is to trust yourself in whatever you're deciding. If you like a flute, and you're not really quite sure why, that's probably okay. If you don't like a flute and you're not really quite sure why, that's probably okay too. Just trust yourself. There are the kind of immutable characteristics of a flute that are very important. The specs, right? And how those specs align with what you want them to be. And sometimes those can't be changed, but I also considered the sound of an instrument to be an immutable characteristic. So if you're dead set on an offset G flute with splitty C sharp, trill, D sharp roller, all the bells and whistles, and then you find an old Powell from the 70s that's inline C foot, but you just can't put it down because the sound is so gorgeous, then maybe you have to reevaluate whether the specs are really that important. And by the way, just a quick aside, I have 10 used flutes that I own.
Oh, wow.
And I don't play them all for everything, but at one point I really wanted a closed hole Muramatsu. So I just ended up finding a really good deal on a closed hole Muramatsu, right? Just the sound of them is very different. So, used flutes can be a fun way to explore different types of personalities you want. And by the way, I'll say my primary flute is a 14 karat gold Miyazawa.
Okay.
So that's a beautiful instrument, but it's about as polar opposite from a closed hole Muramatsu as you can get.
Right. I also play on a 14 karat gold Miyazawa. So
really?
Yeah.
Oh,
we're twins.
Siblings.
I have silver keys. I don't know if yours is all gold.
Silver keys.
Yeah. So we have the same flute. That's cool. That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, I got mine about a little over 10 years ago. So
2005. I bet we have similar numbers.
Yeah, probably. We'll have to compare those. I love that. That's so cool. That's awesome. And then the second question we have is, what is the difference between buying directly from a person selling a flute versus the Flute Center of New York?
Yeah. Interesting line of question there. The biggest biggest difference is, one, if you're unhappy with an individual, you don't have a lot of recourse, unless you're willing to sue them. And even then that can get costly and could potentially outweigh the value of the instrument. We're a business that sells flutes, but I like to think of our business more in the business of customer service, right? So anyone who's worked with us know that we will bend over backwards to provide the top-notch quality customer service to all of our clients, whether they're buyers or sellers. And if for any reason you're really unhappy with your purchase, we're always happy to try to make things right. We also offer trials, which some individual sellers will not offer. We usually pay for shipping, which most individual sellers won't offer, and insurance while they're covered. And of course, there's the convenience of working with the business where there's a phone number you can call, and we have business hours, and we have people who are there to answer your phone and answer your questions and help walk you through the process. And if you want to buy from a seller, but you also want to try a whole bunch of instruments, chances are that seller only has one thing to try.
That's true, yeah.
When you want to buy from us, we can show you 3 used pals from the 80s or 6 different flutes between $8,000 and $9,000, or the same model new versus that same model used, something like that. So you have a real breadth of opportunity to try everything that you want to try.
You're not just like
picking across brands.
Right. You're not just picking one flute and saying, let's just try it out and see if I like it. And it just seems to be a good deal. So I'm just going to hopefully go with that one if I seem to like it. But this way you actually can test things out and be like, yeah, that's actually the flute that I want. And maybe there is a good deal on it or whatever, but it's not just because, oh, that's the only one available, because you guys have such a large inventory to choose from. So that's really helpful. And one thing I wanted to mention too, in terms of the trials, you were mentioning your trials and shipping them out. The thing that I think that's actually really important is 2 things. One, when you go to a shop, let's say, or even if you're going to somebody's house, let's say, and trying their used flute, you're not in your typical environment that you're practicing. So you're not hearing yourself in the way that you're used to hearing yourself. And so it can be, I think, a little confusing when you go elsewhere and you try an instrument and you're like, well, what would this actually sound like in my house? And so I think that's really convenient. And then also the fact that there's a lot of times not a good flute dealer or music shop in a lot of places, and you guys actually ship all throughout the United States. So I think that that's also really beneficial, so that you don't have to worry about like, I have to drive an hour to this flute shop and hopefully they have what I'm looking for, whatever. You guys actually ship directly to the person, which I think is really beneficial.
Yeah, it's actually even if you are fortunate to live within an hour of a flute store, and let's be clear, we are the #1 store when it comes to inventory, triple what our next closest competitor has. So even if you live within an hour of one of our competitors, the chances are of them having everything you're looking for is next to nothing. And I know this video is focusing on pre-owned. We have hundreds, I think last time I checked, about 350 pre-owned instruments in our inventory right now.
Amazing.
Including head joints. And I think that's several orders of magnitude larger than any of our competitors, probably all of our competitors combined.
Yeah, and just for everybody watching too, I have a video about how to set up a flute trial and what that entails and how to go about doing it and everything like that. So make sure to go watch that video. I'll have that link for you guys here. But let's move on to the next question. If I purchase a used instrument from Flute Center, will I need to pay for a COA or adjustments to that instrument?
Good question. In the short term, no. We generally expect to sell all of our instruments in what we would consider to be excellent condition. Okay. That includes visual condition. So any deep scratches or tarnish would usually be removed prior to being listed. We will almost always do any needed repairs or touch-up services as part of the sale.
So like pads or anything like that, like adjustments and everything, you guys would have all working. Yep. And what does the warranty look like if you were to purchase a used instrument from Flute Center?
Yeah, so this is one of those tricky questions where kind of semantics matter. So there are usually 2 types of warranties that we talk about when we're talking about warranties. One is a manufacturer's warranty that protects against any defects that a manufacturer might have in the manufacturing process. That would include things like soldering issues, or plating issues, or some of the boxes coming off of the center joint or the foot joint or the rings, or some things that would require it would require the factory to fix, right?
Right.
No used flutes come with any kind of manufacturer's warranty. Although, depending on what brand you're buying and what kind of level of instrument you're buying, a lot of the higher end ones basically stand by their instruments for life. So if you're buying a Brandon or a Nakahara and there's some kind of a minor manufacturer's issue, even if you're not the first owner, they're so concerned with their pristine reputations that they usually will take care of that. And again, I'm not speaking for any companies, but
just
you
what
know,
you've seen in the past.
right, what I've seen in the past.
Right.
In terms of service warranties, which is what I think a lot of people assume when we talk about warranties, there is no service warranty on a pre-owned flute either, although we do offer service warranties on new flutes. That said, we will never ever sell anyone a lemon, right? We're not like a used car dealers that are like trying to sell it off the lot really quick. So we usually have like a de facto 30 days where if a little problem bubbles up, we'll take care of it as well.
Right.
But the second part of your question was, will I ever have to pay for a COA? Sure. All flutes, whether they're new or pre-owned, they're built in 2021 or 1921, they all require annual maintenance. So, you know, I think a lot of people, when they buy a pre-owned flute, they go, great, so I'll never have to have this flute worked on again. Like, well, no.
But you won't, but you initially won't have to pay for a COA. You'll get the flute, it'll be in working condition, and at some point you'll have to bring it in for adjustments, but initially it will be in good working shape.
We require the sellers to do a COA on the instruments at the time they list the flute. Yeah, so the buyers will not have to pay for a COA at the time of purchase.
Okay, perfect. That kind of answers the next question of what condition would the used flute be in from Flute Center. I guess going further with that is, how used are these used flutes? Yeah, that's interesting.
So Table Bame was the guy who created the mechanism on the flute.
Okay.
We have 8 of his flutes in our inventory, right? That's about as used as you can get from the 1840s. So we have 8 of those, right? Some of those don't play a note at all, but they're still there as physical objects. And then we have some flutes that we sold just a year or 2 ago, and they're on the resale market now. So the full range of possibilities.
Okay, awesome. Let's see here. What is the cost difference between a new or used flute?
Depends on the brand. Some brands just hold their value better than others, and that's usually just a supply demand thing, but it also has to do with how old they are. So, you know, Nagaharas or Brannans tend to hold their value as well as any other maker. They'll depreciate by maybe 10, 20% if they're within, say, 5 or 10 years old, maybe even more than that. But if you start looking at kind of a 30, 40-year time horizon with other brands where there are just more options out there, like the Meinhardt or even Haynes or Powell, they depreciate more. So the cost difference for a brand new Powell right now is like $16,000 for a silver instrument. And for a pre-owned Powell from the 1950s, you could probably find one for about $5,000, give or take.
Yeah. Well, the next question was actually, can I get a bigger bang for my buck getting a used instrument? So it sounds like that is the case if that's something that you're looking into.
Yeah, and this is where my earlier thought about like the kind of immutable characteristics of the flute, where that comes into play. Certainly, if you're just looking at like the flute on paper, yes, a fully handmade flute from the 1950s is like $5,000, but is the sound going to be what you're looking for, right? And that's really up in the air. And so when people say, can I get a better bang for my buck, technically, but to be fair, if that Powell from the 50s has the sound you're looking for, kudos, go for it all day long.
Right.
But a lot of people prefer the sound of a new instrument for any number of reasons, mainly because they've just gotten a lot better at making instruments in the last, especially 10, 20 years.
Just the mechanism and everything like that is just more.
And the head joints especially. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The science of getting into the head joint, the mechanism for sure, but the science of cutting the head joints and creating different cuts and the variants and, you know, a brighter sound or a darker sound, more resistance, less resistance, they've really figured out how to do that. So companies have really decided where they want to fall on the map of different types of colors. Whereas before it was really kind of proprietary, like one person kind of knew how to approximate the best type of sound they could make, but there were just so few makers out there and so few variants among the brands that you really only had like, you know, Haynes and Powell, and so you had the Haynes sound, the Powell sound,
and now there's just so many more makers, and within those makers, it's not just like one cut of head joint. There's like so many, like a lot of them have many cuts of head joints within just Haynes
That's right.
or Miyazawa or Powell or whatever it may be.
That's right.
And so what about this? Here's a question. So let's say you're looking at a Powell, a brand new Powell versus one that is, let's say, 3 or 4 years old. What's that price difference going to be? Do you have any idea?
20%, give or
20%.
take. Yeah, it depends on specs. It depends on material. It depends on market conditions.
Yeah.
The price of gold has really skyrocketed in the last couple of years. So a brand new gold one might run you in the mid 50,000s, solid gold with gold keys. Resale value is probably in the high 30s. So you're going to probably lose a higher percentage of that just because the market is there's so much less demand for pre-owned all gold flutes.
I see.
But if it's a silver flute and Powell hasn't really made a lot of updates to like the quality of their mechanism or anything, it's a very solid mechanism in the last few years, then the difference between a brand new one for 16 and a pre-owned one for 13.5 or 12 or something around there, it's essentially the same flute. I mean,
Right.
there's not a lot of
It's knocking off a couple
depreciation.
$1,000s. And
Exactly,
it's
yeah.
basically the same flute. But then it sounds like if you're in the market for getting a gold flute, then it might make sense to get an older, if that's your price point and you can find one that has like the options and everything that you like and one that you sound good on, it might actually make sense to get the pre-owned one, since it would knock off quite a bit of the price.
Yeah, the higher the price point you get, the more of a seller's market, the more of a buyer's market it is for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, there's way more product on the market for all gold instruments than there are buyers. So it's usually if you find one that you like, you usually can get a pretty good deal on it.
Yeah, that's good to know. The next question that we have is recommendations for buying a used conservatory flute for music school.
Sure. It depends on price point. When I think of a conservatory flute, I'm definitely thinking handmade. So I'm thinking about something like a Miyazawa or a Muramatsu or a Powell or a Haynes or a Brannan. You can find really excellent ones pre-owned for starting at about 5,000-6,000, brand new for about the same price. The difference is going to be the material. The brand new ones are just going to have less silver than the pre-owned ones for the same price. Yeah, but I would tend to stay away from, so kind of a big picture idea here, just to take a step back. I usually tend to recommend brands based on their flagships, right? So when you think about a brand like Nagahara or Brannan or Powell or Burkhardt or Haynes or Muramatsu, you're looking at all these brands, or Miyazawa, like the two of us have, who pride themselves on putting out the finest quality product they can put out, right? Mm-hmm. Those brands also happen to put out instruments with drawn tonals instead of soldered, or silver plated mechanism instead of silver mechanism, or basically areas where you're compromising in either material or in some kind of manufacturing capacity to accommodate price points, right? The other side of that equation are brands like Gemeinhardt or Yamaha or Pearl, who do an excellent job putting out the most affordable, highest quality for the price point student model flute, and then also sell up, right? So Gemeinhardt makes a really great flute for between $2,000 and $3,000. They would call it a conservatory model flute. I don't know a lot of people who are in conservatory playing those flutes, although I had one for high school and for the first 2 years of college. So it served me well for about 4 years. So I would recommend a fully handmade flute, whether it's all silver or not, at least a handmade instrument, because the handmadeness, if we can turn that into an adjective, it's going to be what allows you to practice hours and hours and hours and hours without the flute beginning to not deteriorate, but need more frequent adjustments.
Right. That totally makes sense. And one thing that I noticed, at least when I was going to school, and I know it's different wherever you end up going to school, but I noticed that a lot of the flute players started getting more gold features on their flute, whether it's a gold lip plate or a gold head joint or a gold flute and things like that. And it just started ramping up a lot more once I got to the conservatory level. Do you find that that's typically the case?
Yes, although I don't necessarily believe it's because you need to have gold to be successful.
No, definitely not that.
Yeah.
No.
I think that there's I don't know. I mean, I grew up with listening to James Galway and he was the man with the golden flute. And so it kind of became like a thing where everyone wanted the gold flute, even
a thing.
18-year-olds heading off to college, so
Really? That's interesting.
I was one of them. I mean, yeah, I got my Miyazawa when I was 19 years old, something like
Oh
that.
wow,
So
I love that. That's cool. Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, like what I noticed, it was just more like people needed the gold, like a little bit more resistance that the gold was providing, whereas their silver wasn't providing as much resistance that they needed. So that's kind of like what I was thinking.
Resistance can come from a number of places, though. Certainly, material can play a role there. A different head joint cut can also provide more
Right.
resistance for sure. A different brand.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, gold's expensive though. I mean,
It
I
is.
would, and there's a color difference there that I wouldn't say is linear, right?
Right.
Platinum is not always better than gold. Gold is not always better
That's
than
true.
silver. Silver is not always better than nickel.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, as an artist, as somebody who's trying to become an artist, you have to decide what sound is most you, and that might be gold or might be silver. It might not be.
Yeah.
It might be wood.
Yeah, and it depends also. I've noticed like where you are in your development because there's certain like when I was getting my flute, I did try an all gold flute. And at the time, I sounded pretty terrible on it. And I was open to getting one, but I didn't sound good on it. So I ended up going with the gold with silver keys. But then I shouldn't have done this, but at a convention a couple years ago for fun, I was like, I'm just going to try an all gold. I think it was a Burkhart. And I was like, I'm just going to try an all gold, or maybe it was a Haynes, I forget, one of the two. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a flute I really, really want. I don't need it right now, but I do love how I sound on it. So it's just interesting, like with time, like also your playing style changes and your growth and everything like that. And that really contributes to what you actually sound good on. And I always like to reiterate to everybody, just because you got this particular flute does not mean that you're going to sound better, whether it's a particular maker or a particular metal or anything like that. It really depends on just you and your playing style and what feels most comfortable to you.
That's absolutely right. And a little like a life hack here is if you ever end up finding a flute that's way more than you were hoping to spend on an instrument, a lot of companies offer their head joints as available for separate purchase. And especially if you're looking at a gold head joint to put on a silver body, those can usually work with some kind of permanent tape or applying layers of metal to make it fit properly. But you can get an approximation of that sound by just having the head joint on there. So the resale head joint market is very vibrant. A lot of people are searching for different head joints, and you can dramatically alter the sound of your current instrument by just changing the head joint.
Yeah, that's what I personally did when I went to college originally. I had a Miyazawa before that too, actually, silver one. And then I ended up adding a silver with a gold lip plate and then eventually going to all gold. Gold with silver keys. But so that's what I did. So I definitely agree with that. Another question that we have here is, are there some materials that are better than others while buying a used flute? Example, silver versus gold.
No, I think, again, if we're looking at handmade instruments, the material is going to be consistent. I mean, silver and gold sound different, and they can be different weights. Gold flutes tend to be heavier, so there's a consideration to be made there, but it isn't much in the way of an indication of quality necessarily. And there can be a sound difference, but it isn't linear. Gold isn't always better than silver. The one thing that I would say with pre-owned instruments is that, I mean, as a flute that's made out of solid silver or solid gold or any solid material, it's just that material. Tarnish can be removed, fine. Gold doesn't tarnish, but nickel with a silver plating, eventually the plating will wear. And once it begins wearing, it's usually not cost effective to have it replated. So that's a consideration to make. A handmade flute like a Muramatsu with plated keys will usually have no plating issues or exceedingly rare. But an instrument like an Azumi or a Sonare or a Gemeinhardt, or an instrument that's like a factory-made instrument, eventually they'll have plating. It may not be for 20 or 40 years, but eventually anything with a silver plating on it will begin to see some plating wear. So that's the only time I would mention that as a concern. But that's something you should be able to see really easily. If you see it, and frankly you feel it too, because when it's wearing, it creates a kind of bubbling effect on the keys. So if you don't see that, then you're pretty in the clear, regardless of what the material's made out of. So all that to say, again, if it's a good quality make from an initial quality standpoint, you're probably okay with buying it. And you should be able to see pretty easily if it's in a condition that's less desirable.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's all the questions that I have here. Is there anything else that you want to add about that? About buying a pre-owned flute, I mean.
About buying a pre-owned flute, the only thing I would add is if you're in the market to buy a pre-owned flute, then call the Flute Center of New York.
Yes, of course.
And the other side of that is keep an open mind to buying new as well. Only because I've just seen it happen too many times. So somebody comes in, they're fixated. I'm going to buy a Powell from 1975. It must be inline, must be C-foot, must be this, must be this. And then when they end up finally trying things, they hate that flute, you know? And then you never want to box yourself into a corner, back yourself into a corner where you're disappointed in something because that one thing doesn't meet your expectation. So one piece of advice, regardless of what you're looking at buying, including cars or houses, is keep an open mind and just kind of let the right thing come to you.
I mean, and that's what I did. I know we're talking about flutes right now, but like with piccolos, when I was looking for a new one, I had an idea of what I was looking for, but I did try several different makers, and I tried different head joints, and I tried silver keys versus gold keys, and just like different head joints and everything like that, because I, at the end of the day, wanted to get the best instrument for me at that time. And I didn't want it to be like, well, I want to get this particular instrument because that might not be the best one. So I think it's important. And it sounds like what you're saying is like, have an idea, of course, of what you're looking for, but also being open to other things, and maybe do a trial that you're like, okay, let's try this particular thing that I want, whether it's a used flute or a new flute or whatever it may be, but be open to trying other things along with that and see what works best for you. And it might be that one thing that you were, you know, having your eye on, but it also might be something else.
Totally. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I so appreciate it. And I'll make sure to put all of Flute Center's contact information at the end of this so that they can get in contact with you. And I just really appreciate you taking the time out today to answer all these questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Gina.
I want to thank Julian again for hopping on this call with me. I learned a lot, and I'm sure you guys did as well. If you have any questions for myself or Julian, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. You can also reach out to the Flute Center of New York directly through their website, and you can ask them any questions that you might have about purchasing a pre-owned instrument. Like I said at the beginning of this video, my next video topic will be about consigning your flutes with the Flute Center of New York, so selling your flutes with the Flute Center. So if you're interested, make sure that you're subscribed to my channel. You can also follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and I'll see you soon.